Alright guys, welcome to an opinion-based discussion video about weapon viability in PvP. What I explain to you now is only my opinion on the topic. Many people will disagree, others will agree. That's what opinions are about. So this discussion really started out when PvP Skills released a top 10 list of weapons for Dark Souls 2 PvP. While he tried to make it as objective as possible, it became pretty clear for the viewer that the list lacked consistency in criteria for what he ranked the weapon and that the list was a bit questionable overall, like excluding Ice Rapier and Chaos Blade while including Battle Axe, Bandit Axe and Warped Sword, which are actually even better in my opinion. The fairly well-known streamer Skorbrand made a comment chain about what his opinion on the list is on Reddit. In it he shows the flaws of PvP skills list, with which I mostly agree. But one central argument that Skorbrand uses totally differs from my opinion. He basically says that in order to create an appropriate weapon rank list for PvP, you have to look solely on its viability with the highest skill level in mind and with equally skilled opponents in mind. What this basically means is you have to be one of the best players in the game's PvP and you have to fight one of the best players in this game's PvP in order to determine how good a weapon is for PvP overall. Now, let's actually try to imagine how often this occurs. If I would actually be, or if I would actually try to be, one of the best players in this game's PvP, the only fights which would count for weapon viability are not even 1% of the fights in the arena, against which I come against other best players of the game. This rate would be even lower if you PvP on the bridge or invade in other areas. So he basically wants to determine a weapon viability, the usefulness of it in situations that are extremely rare or actually never occur for 99% of the game's PvP players, since they are not top tier players. That's like 99% of the players just play the PvP for fun and are not considered top tier. So they would never actually have a fight in which the criteria that Skorbrand wants to set for the weapon's viability will actually occur. So I totally have to disagree with this opinion. For me, and I believe for most other PvP players too, the actual weapon viability is determined by its overall usefulness in all kinds of PvP situations. Given the circumstances which Skorbrand describes are included in those, but are not at all the only criteria for a weapon to be viable. I know Skorbrand and many others will disagree with this opinion, but like I said, it's an opinion on which the viewer should decide what criteria he wants to determine a weapon's true viability. So let's actually come to the point where I would just suggest my criteria and PvP situations that should be included rather than excluded when thinking about weapons viability. This is the viability of a weapon for as much people as possible, no matter how much they are experienced in the game's PvP. I think this should be a factor when making a weapon rank list for PvP, since the majority of the audience will click on the video since they want to actually see what weapon could be the most viable for them, not just for a vast minority of PvPers in the highest skill tiers. Yeah, so to answer the question of those people, how good is this weapon, since that's what they click on a top tier list video on YouTube, how good is this weapon? I want to know how good this weapon is for me or for most other players. So I think we should consider all or as many different PvP situations that the weapon could come up against as possible, and how it is capable of handling these on different skill levels. For example, just to pick a few of those, we should look separately on the weapon's usefulness in 1v1 PvP duels on highest skill levels. That is the part that Skorbrand would consider where he would rate the viability on the weapon. But I would include 1v1 PvP duels when used by newcomers or average players, since that's what most players are, or the usefulness in duels or invasions against healers, since you come across many healers if you PvP in the game. The fights against all kinds of builds, like mages or just ranged people or only melee people, which you come also across. Fights against massively overleveled opponents, since that's what you come across in the late game PvP if your soul memory raises. Gangspanks, which you also come across a lot if you invade randomly. And the weapon usefulness on different levels and setups. If you watch a weapon top tier list, you want to actually know what builds this weapon is actually viable to use on, since if you run a soul strength build and want to use a katana, it's really not viable anymore, since you can't even wield it. So, to make this clear, I will use an example of the Curved Dragon Greatsword. The general opinion on this weapon in the eyes of top tier players is, it is garbage. It has only one useful attack, the two-handed running attack, which is even worse than the ones all greatswords have, since it's slow, and the animation is the same. It would be rated as a low tier weapon on a low rank in Skorbrand's list. Now if you don't know what I'm talking about in those top tier players, those are most times streamers or people who watch those streams, and those streamers try to make the Dark Souls 2 PvP basically competitive. Like, they only use the most useful attacks that weapons have, and they try to be competitive with those weapons. And if they fight each other, those fights are most times very entertaining to watch, since they are both extremely skilled and know how to avoid each kind of attacks. But now let's look at other situations than these. Like for newcomers, this weapon is quite viable, with its quite damaging guaranteed R1/R1 combos. The two-handed R2, which can make pressure on the opponent even from range, and the big hitbox and reach. Here, the weapon seems quite viable already, or at least would not be rated utter garbage. So let's look at Gangspanks. The R1/R1 combos can take huge chunks of one of the multiple opponent's health, while having a good stagger to recover from the attack, if you hit them. The R2 attacks have a ranged knockback, which can even hit through walls. This makes the R2 most useful tool for Gangspanks, if used with the environment correctly. So for Gangspanks, this weapon is amazing and almost one of the best ones. Let's go really quick over other situations. The R2s could punish people who run away to heal. The R1/R1 combos, especially two-handed, can sometimes even out-trade Estus. The high stagger and high damage of the weapon makes it useful against extremely high-leveled, high-poise opponents too. So to determine the full weapon's viability for PvP, we would have to go over many more situations with it, and use it for a long time, of course. But from those examples, it gets already clear that the weapon moves away from its utter garbage rating of the top tier players list and takes a place as a nicely damaging, overall good, but not insanely great weapon for PvP. So for the too long didn't watch. I think the approach that Skorbrand has to determine weapons viability for PvP, being only two top tier players fighting which both use the most useful moves of the weapon, is quite questionable for determining the weapon's viability for PvP overall. I think we should watch over all pros and cons of the weapons, all different situations it can come up against, and all skill levels, to determine an actual useful weapon list for 99% of the PvP players. And that being said, I think it has a reason why Mr. I Won't Forget is the biggest Dark Souls 2 weapon showcase YouTuber, since he does exactly that. Exactly those criteria. Keep that in mind, my opinion, and with this opinion in mind, I think the PvP skills top tier weapon list is not as bad as if you read Skorbrand's comment chain. Make up your own opinion on it, and thanks for watching.